Man-Made Monsters. Non-fiction story by Daniel Cohen. With the publication of Mary W. Shelley's novel Frankenstein, or the Modern Prometheus, in 1818, the mad scientist replaced the evil sorcerer as the master of monsters. In many respects, the mad scientist and the evil sorcerer were very similar. They were not necessarily either mad or evil, at least not at first. Often they were brilliant, selfless, and dedicated to the task of acquiring knowledge. For the sorcerer, magical knowledge; for the scientist, scientific knowledge that might benefit the human race. But the knowledge they sought was forbidden to mankind. Often, for the best of motives, both sorcerer and scientist released great evil upon the world, and their knowledge ultimately destroyed them. That is why Mrs. Shelley chose the subtitle, or the Modern Prometheus, for her book. Prometheus was one of the titans of Greek mythology. He was supposed to have given the human race the knowledge of fire, but this gift angered the gods, and they punished him savagely. Mary Shelley's scientist, Baron Victor von Frankenstein, attempted something no medieval sorcerer, no matter how powerful, could even aspire to. He sought to create life. Thus, Dr. Frankenstein's creation is the first truly modern monster in fiction. According to tradition, the idea of the Frankenstein monster was first put into words in Switzerland on a stormy evening in 1816. A group of friends decided to pass the evening by telling stories based on supernatural events. Among those attending this storytelling session were two English poets, Lord Byron and Percy Bysshe Shelley. Also in attendance were Shelley's wife, Mary, and Byron's personal physician and friend, Dr. John Polidori. Dr. Polidori was reported to have told the tale of Lord Ruthven, who was to become the first famous vampire in English fiction. But surely the high point of the evening must have been Mary Shelley's story of Dr. Frankenstein and his creation. There had never been anything quite like the Frankenstein monster in legend or fiction, but there were a few creatures the monster might have counted among its ancestors. One was Talus, a sort of ancient robot of Greek mythology. Talus was said to have been made of brass by Hephaestus, a god of fire and craftsman. The job of the brass man was to protect the island of Crete. He drove off strangers by throwing rocks at them or by heating himself red hot and clasping the intruders in a lethal bear hug. Talus was animated by a single vein of blood running from his head to his foot, where it was closed with a nail. The powerful sorceress Medea put Talus to sleep and then cut the vein, allowing the vital fluid to pour out, thus killing the brass man. Somewhat closer to the Frankenstein monster was the golem, a creature of medieval Jewish legend. It was a clay figure said to be given life by some sort of magical charm. According to the legends, golems had been created by several famous medieval European rabbis. The golem was supposed to be a servant and protector of the Jews, but it was untrustworthy. Rabbi Loew of 16th century Prague had to destroy the golem he created when it went berserk. Frankenstein's castle was located in the hills above the picturesque Bavarian city of Ingolstadt. Some have speculated that the inspiration for the Frankenstein story may have come from a German legend. There is a ruined castle outside of Frankfurt am Main, Germany, that contains the tomb of a medieval knight. This knight was supposed to have been killed by a ferocious man-eating, man-made monster that resembled a wild boar. But the legend itself is not at all clear, and there is no way of knowing if this story or anything like it was ever encountered by Mary Shelley, although she was known to have traveled extensively in Europe. More likely, Mrs. Shelley drew her inspiration for the story of Frankenstein from events of her own time. Science was becoming ever more important, and it increasingly clashed with established beliefs and values. Frankenstein put life back into a creature that had been assembled from the limbs and organs of cadavers. During the 18th and much of the 19th centuries, human bodies were not readily available for scientific study. Dissection of a corpse was considered both irreligious and illegal. The result was that doctors who wished to study the human anatomy had to employ the services of body snatchers who would exhume newly buried corpses or cut down the hanging corpses of executed criminals and deliver them in secret to the laboratories. While doctors couldn't dissect a body legally, it was considered perfectly proper to leave the corpse of a hanged man swinging until it rotted, as an example to other potential wrongdoers. Interest in medical science had grown enormously while the laws concerning dissection had not kept pace, so the body snatchers, the resurrectionists, or sack-em-up men as they were called in England, had a flourishing trade. If an adequate supply of corpses was unavailable, some of the more enterprising body snatchers would murder some unfortunates in order to sell their bodies. The most notorious of these murderers were Burke and Hare, who operated in Edinburgh, Scotland, at about the time that Frankenstein was written. The practice was fairly common throughout Europe, and many respectable doctors simply closed their eyes to what was happening. Dr. Frankenstein himself was forced to steal bodies for his experiments, and this was the first step in his crime. He had not intended to create a monster, rather he had hoped to create a perfect human being. But from the moment the creature opened its dull yellow eye, the young scientist was overcome with disgust and horror. He realized that he had made an abomination, not a Superman. The monster in Mary Shelley's book is described as being exceptionally tall, yellow-eyed, and having skin like parchment. But few picture the Frankenstein monster as looking like that. Our image was fixed in 1931 with the appearance of the movie Frankenstein, starring a then unknown actor named Boris Karloff as the monster. Karloff's monster was a masterpiece of horrific makeup. It had a flat head and the overhanging brows of a Neanderthal man. Its face was crisscrossed with crude stitching and 2 electrodes stuck out of its neck. Like Mary Shelley's monster, the movie monster was unnaturally tall, but it also wore enormous leaden shoes and walked in a stiff, almost mechanical way. The monster of the book becomes tremendously evil, but it is an evil forced upon the creature by its unnatural creation. All mankind flees from it in horror, and the monster in revenge turns upon mankind and particularly upon its unfortunate creator. The monster of the book is also intelligent and highly articulate about its plight. At one point it says, "I am malicious because I am miserable. If any being felt emotions of benevolence toward me, I should return them an 100 and an 100-fold. For that one creature's sake, I would make peace with the whole kind." The first of the long series of Frankenstein films simplified Mrs. Shelley's plot, but retained much of the sympathy toward the monster. However, the creature's intelligence is largely lost in the films. Instead of making long, soul-searching speeches, the monster can only mumble and grunt. In later films, the monster loses even this rudimentary speaking ability. It is reduced to a stiff, stumbling, and thoroughly evil automaton, more of a mechanical man than anything else.